Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Robert Lillard, Medical Director for the Cumberland Pediatric Foundation, and we're glad to have you here today talking about vaccines for COVID. And today we're going to spotlight the newest recommendations for those vaccines, and that's what we've waited for so long, and that's for children under the age of 5, which was recently approved by both the FDA and the CDC. And people right now are rolling out these vaccines, and we wanted to make sure you had the best information that you can to talk to your patients and recommend these vaccines. So I'm happy to be joined again today by a trusted expert, Dr. Buddy Creech, who is director of the Vanderbilt Vaccine Research Program. And Buddy, thank you again for coming in.
Thanks, Rob. I'm glad to be here.
Good. Well, let's talk a little bit about this. A lot of parents, they're excited, but they're probably concerned, and they, rightly so. So they're coming into offices, they're asking questions, why should we get this vaccine? And let's go through some of those points that we're hearing from some of our members, some of the concerns, and I'll have you reply to each kind of concern that we hear. First of all, my child's had COVID, okay? Do I really need this vaccine? I mean, we had it, we got that illness, it should last, right? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. Not all infections are created equally. And we've known from the beginning of the pandemic that the more mild the symptoms, the more mild the immune response. And so I think it's a misnomer to think that folks can rely simply on wild type infection-based immunity. And so I think vaccines really stand in the gap there to say, let's put everybody on a level playing field of protection by filling in those gaps that may exist because their infection was so mild. So I think there's some wisdom in waiting a period of time after a wild type infection. CDC now recommends that we can wait maybe around 90 days after infection before we really need to promote vaccine. But I think it's the best way that we can protect people against severe disease.
Perfect. So, what about the idea that this is really mild for kids, right? I mean, everyone seems to get a little cold, it's better, we're over it, we're protected. If it's so mild, why should we get the vaccine in the first place?
This is really hard. And for anyone who watched the VRPAT meeting, which I did because I popped popcorn and loved it, Dr. Hildreth made this comment that we've got to live in this tension of recommending the vaccine to parents, but also acknowledging that for most children, it is a mild infection that sometimes we miss because it's so pauci-symptomatic or even asymptomatic. Here are the things that give us concern. Number one, more children have died from COVID-19 directly than they have from influenza in a typical influenza year, or even during our significant influenza years. So it's worse than influenza in the terms of numbers of deaths. That's number one. Number two is not all children have mild infection. We see hospitalizations, especially among those who have chronic medical conditions, but also healthy kids. We see those who have myocarditis and blood clots, encephalitis, multisystem inflammatory syndrome. And the problem is, number three, we don't know how to predict who's going to have these bad outcomes, including long COVID. So because of that, because it is severe and leads to death, because it is severe and leads to hospitalization and sometimes some lasting morbidity, and because we can't predict which children are going to go which direction, it only makes sense to recommend vaccine for our parents.
Right. And I think I would add to that, this is currently, I believe, the 5th leading cause of death in children under the age of 5. And vaccinating against this will eliminate a lot more deaths than some of the other vaccine preventable diseases that we have had in place for a long time. So great. So, all right, so we get the vaccine. Everything goes great, but people still get infected after the vaccine. So it's really not preventing it, right?
This is actually a really important question right now. We're doing really well preventing hospitalization and death. That part is true. And our vaccine effectiveness in the real world for those bad outcomes, it remains very, very high. And I think that's what we've got to rely on. Are we still seeing breakthrough infections? Absolutely we are, especially as BA4 and the BA5 subvariants of Omicron have really become the predominant strains. BA5 now accounts for 50 or 60% of all new cases. The reason that's important is that it has emerged as a leading subvariant because it does evade our immune response better than some of the other forms of COVID have. We can still prevent hospitalization and death. We can still make symptoms way milder than they otherwise would be. We have not yet cracked the code to prevent all cases of the common cold. And this is one of the reasons why we'll be playing a little bit of cat and mouse with this virus for the next few months or even years, as we try to chase it a little bit as it presents new forms to us. Thankfully, as those new forms emerge, they are often milder and they resemble our typical respiratory illnesses a bit more, which is great for adults, but it's actually more challenging for kids. When we saw Delta and then especially Omicron come through, we actually started seeing more of those early childhood respiratory virus phenotypes that we're all accustomed to, like bronchiolitis and croup and prolonged coughing illnesses and the otitis that can come with those respiratory illnesses. So I think one tool to maybe pull from with parents is to say, we're at a different time in the pandemic than we were early on. And while children have been relatively under-affected by this virus, they still can develop severe disease. They can still develop typical respiratory infections that have a whole host of complications, even when it's just a mild common cold. We may not be able to prevent the common cold completely, but we can certainly make it milder.
Okay. And I'm going to follow up on that just a little bit, because in the news lately, we've heard a lot about this change in the vaccine to include the Omicron variant. So maybe another question that'll come up, maybe we should just wait when that one comes out. Wouldn't that be better to have more strains in the vaccine?
Yeah, I think if you were going to live in a air-controlled unit in the basement for the next 3 to 4 months, that might fly. But if you're a typical kid, that's not going to work out so well. I think the best thing to do is to get vaccinated now, lay down that fundamental immune response to this ancestral Wuhan strain, which is still the best way for us to generate a very broad neutralizing antibody response. And then when the time comes in the fall, yeah, let's get that Omicron specific booster to fill in the gaps where that original vaccine may be missing. I think that's how all of us are going to navigate this pandemic, is having the immunity we need right now that is the best we can offer. And then when those Omicron specific boosters are available, let's do that. But I think it would be unwise to postpone and wait until that new one comes along, because disease is fairly common right now.
Right. And I think we've seen, like you had mentioned earlier, a pretty good protection against severe disease and hospitalization from the current vaccine.
That's right.
Okay, so let's talk about general safety, because finally, if we address all those points, people are still like, but is it safe? What's it going to do to my child? Other than the obvious fever and things like that, what do we know?
Yeah, this is one of the things I love talking about, because I think it is really important to provide parents with all the resources they need to make that good decision for their families. We hear both sides of the coin. We hear, why did this take so long, with a pounding of the fist? And then we have another group that says this happened too fast. And I don't know how to reconcile those, other than to say it did take a while, because we had specific safety measures in place as we studied these vaccines in children. And no, it's not too early, because we have all the data we need to be able to make a recommendation to use these vaccines. So here's what we know. Tens of thousands of children below the age of 12 have been enrolled in either the Pfizer or the Moderna study. And those children were studied just like the adults, where every time they got a dose of vaccine, we watched them throughout the entire study, but really in earnest in that first week after vaccine, to document every possible side effect they could have. And what we saw for both Pfizer and Moderna is that the side effect profile matches what we would see with other childhood vaccines. It's things like injection site pain in about 90%. We also saw fever in a small number of individuals. Some were actually fairly high. And so we want to counsel parents about maybe using Tylenol or Motrin around the time of vaccine if they wish to, in order to prevent high fevers that would be either uncomfortable or in some rare number of children might provoke a febrile seizure. What I think we also saw was fatigue at a little bit of a higher rate than what we would normally see with vaccines. I have to admit, not a single parent in our study, when they would report fatigue, ever complained that their child took an extra long nap the next day. They were quite fine with that. It was very short-lived, and it really was that. It was an extra nap. Other side effects we just didn't see in the studies. We didn't see serious adverse events. We didn't see hospitalizations. We didn't see myocarditis or multisystem inflammatory syndrome. The vaccines were very well tolerated. Not only that, as we've seen the rollout of these vaccines in other countries, in adolescents and in school-age children, we've seen them do very well, both with the immediate side effect profile of the vaccine, but also more unusual side effects. I will mention one. Myocarditis has been an important side effect that we've seen from the mRNA vaccines in young, healthy adult males and older teenage males. We're watching this very carefully. We don't anticipate that there will be a substantial number of those cases in young children. For those of you who may have seen this, it's short-lived. It seems to resolve on its own without much in the way of intervention. We're now doing long-term follow-up studies of those children as part of a CDC initiative. But my point there is that the overall safety profile of these vaccines is remarkably good. And we should be able to give parents some reassurance that not only the short-term, but the long-term consequences of these vaccines are on par with the other vaccines we use.
Perfect. All right, Dr. Creech, you have convinced me. I'm ready to go. But there's two choices, right? You've got Pfizer, you've got Moderna. What's the pros and cons of each? Does it matter? What do you think?
Yeah, so let me start by saying I was an investigator and the principal investigator of the Moderna KidCo study, so the one down from 11 down. So I want to be mindful of that inherent bias. I'll say this: the best vaccine to get is the one that's in stock at your pediatrician's office, and so just get it, and it doesn't really matter. And if you switch pediatricians and you go from Pfizer to Moderna or Moderna to Pfizer, not going to matter. That's totally fine. What we know is this. We know that the Pfizer vaccine differs in the amount of vaccine by age, just like Moderna, where the older kids are getting the same amount as adults. The older school-age kids are getting about a third of the dose, and the kids less than 5 are getting 1/10 of the dose. That's one of the reasons why the FDA authorized a 3-dose series of Pfizer and a 2-dose series of Moderna. It's that Pfizer dropped that dose down so low that the way they were measuring the immune response, they really need 3 doses before they reach that threshold that they really want. For Moderna, kids over 12, they're getting the regular adult version of the vaccine. Kids less than 12 are getting the quarter dose of vaccine. And that includes those kids less than 6 years of age. Those ages are just a little bit different between Pfizer and Moderna, unfortunately. By getting a quarter dose of vaccine, we can't really compare apples to apples here. 25 micrograms of Moderna isn't 8 times more than the 3 micrograms of Pfizer, but there is slightly more antigen in the Moderna vaccine. As a result, we are seeing numerically higher antibody titers. We're sometimes seeing higher side effect profiles after vaccine, barely. And maybe initially we saw some differences in the rates of myocarditis that may be evening out as we use more and more vaccine. So the point of that would be there's some indication that Moderna might be more effective, especially in the adult populations that we've studied. There may be some indication that Moderna's side effect profile, because there is slightly more antigen, might be a little more robust. But either way, this is splitting hairs. I think the best vaccine to get is the one that makes the most sense for your practice. There are some practices who just want to stick with a brand because they can train their staff up on just one. There are others who may want to offer Moderna because there's been a lot of requests by parents that I'm aware of for wanting one brand over another. So I think it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and I've heard that from practices. Some want to just stock one for the simplicity, especially with staffing issues that are currently abound everywhere. Whereas others are afraid, and people have told them, if you don't have that one, I'll go somewhere else, and maybe they don't get it at all. So some people are weighing that and stocking a little bit of both. Okay, great. Now we talked a little bit about myocarditis. Let's go back and talk about the dosing schedule because it's changed a little bit from what we heard initially with adults. That Pfizer was separated first and second dose by 3 weeks, 4 weeks between the first and second of Moderna. But now we're talking a little differently about that, maybe spacing that first dose a little more. Can you talk about that and maybe the effect that could have potentially on reducing side effects or myocarditis in particular?
Yeah, I would consider this next section one of the most important elements of COVID vaccines for young children right now. And I want to hit 2 things. Number one is spacing between infection and first dose or any dose of vaccine. And the CDC has now changed their recommendations to suggest that many experts recommend waiting somewhere around 3 months between an infection and the next dose of vaccine. And part of the reason for this is an immunologic benefit. You don't need to slam those two events together. It's largely a safety event. We really don't need to give the vaccine right after an infection because there will be some immunity. And we don't think we want to risk any safety questions there of multisystem inflammatory syndrome or any increased reactogenicity because we gave a vaccine so close to infection. So that's number one, 90 days after infection, totally reasonable time frame to wait. Second one is what you specifically asked about, is the interval between doses. Early in the pandemic, we sacrificed long-term immunity in order to get as many people maximally immune as quickly as possible. So we gave 2 doses 1 month apart. We recognized that we paid a price for that. And so we had to come back later and give that 3rd dose several months later. What the Canadians have done for their pediatric rollout is they have established 8 weeks as their time frame between 1st and 2nd doses for kids less than 12. And what the CDC has now recommended is that we too can wait anywhere from 3 to 8 weeks for Pfizer, 4 to 8 weeks for Moderna. But quite frankly, even if you gave it at an even more prolonged interval, it's totally fine. There's a great paper from the UK looking at a 12-week interval that appears to be immunologically ideal for giving people that antibody diversity and durability that you really want from a vaccine. I can tell you what we did in our family. My son got 2 doses 3 months apart. He's an older teenage boy that potentially would be at risk for myocarditis. And it was at a time we didn't exactly know what the epi of that was going to look like. My daughter, who's 10, got 2 doses 8 weeks apart because we heart Canada. And so we really like that immunologic distance, if you will, between doses 1 and 2, because again, it lays down an even more durable memory response, and it allows a bit more diversity in the antibody response. It also probably reduces the side effects. So when we did the Moderna study, we saw in many situations a doubling of the reaction rate after the 2nd dose compared to the 1st, whether that's headache, fatigue, lymph node swelling. It was still uncommon, but it was about twice as much after that 2nd dose. When we space it out in the small studies that have been done so far, not only is there often less reactogenicity, that first week of symptoms, there also is a hint that there's less cases of myocarditis in that regard. So I think the data are compelling that for families who need rapid immunity, let's do it and we're safe. For those who have the luxury of waiting a little bit, we know there may be some immunologic and safety benefits there.
Perfect. Well, if that doesn't convince you, I don't know what will. So that's good to know. Now, in an office, obviously, keeping up with this and what you order and how to store it and all those sorts of things, one of the unfortunate parts of this is it's becoming increasingly complex, keeping up with all the regulations and what you need to do. I don't know if we really have the time to cover that well here, but what I want everyone watching this to know is that at the Cumberland Pediatric Foundation for our members, we are happy to assist you in as many ways as possible for you to get the vaccine to your office and get those vaccines into people's arms. And we have lots of resources. We're working with the state quite closely with in this regard, and we can get you all the information you need to support you in storage requirements, getting the vaccine to your office. Please reach out to us. We'd be happy to help. So thank you so much, buddy. I think this is great information, and we look forward to maybe talking again in the future as things, because I don't think this is going away anytime soon, and we have not read the last chapter, I don't think, to this book. So thank you again, and we look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate it.
All right, take care.